Ambassador Blinken, Vera, Consul General, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you very much for coming all to this lecture. It's great to be back to Colombia after 2 years. When Victoria de Grazia introduced me, he benignly said that I have studied at the Budapest University of Economics, but when I was preparing for this lecture, I tried to recall the times when I went to university. I started in 1986, and at that time, that university was called the Karl Marx University of Economics in Budapest. And when I finished my studies in 91, that was already Budapest University of Economics. And the reason I'm telling this to you is because when I started my studies, the introductory subject to economics was political economy in the Marxist way. And when I finished, we were already studying economic policy. And then when I finished my studies, I thought for the rest of my life, I have never have to deal with political economy because now we are in a different environment. And in the post-2008, post-crisis environment, I had to realize that political economy is back with a vengeance. Not necessarily in the Marxist way, but political economy is determining the outcome of many of the political tendencies and social tendencies in our world. Not just in Central Europe, but that is definitely true for the whole of Europe. But as a young student, when I finished university, and Hungary was just beyond the big change from being a communist country to becoming a converging Western country or European country. We were very optimistic, and we had a great consensus in our society, and that is true for all the countries in the region, at least in the Visegrad countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, and then Czech Republic and Slovakia, and other countries. We were all very optimistic, and we had a wide-ranging consensus that from now on, three basic things will determine the route that we are on. One, we are going to become a Western-style democracy with rule of law, constitutionalism, and a strong institutional framework, as we have seen in the West. Second, almost all citizens have agreed that Hungary and those other countries will need to switch very quickly from a centrally planned, state-controlled and owned economy to a market-based, private ownership-dominated economy. That was a wide consensus. Not everybody believed in the free market. That was above the head of many people. But all Hungarian citizens wanted to live like their Austrian neighbors. And they have also seen that East Germany versus West Germany clearly shows the difference in the efficiency of the two economic models. So that was the second point of consensus. The first was democracy, the second was market economy and private ownership. The third thing was that after so many years in the sort of Eastern alliance of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and the Comecon, it's high time that Hungary is pursuing its 1,000-year-old ambition, which is also true for Poland and the other Visegrad countries, to belong to the West. That in our history it was always bad when we belonged to the East, very often through coercion and military invasion. And it was always better when we tried to go our original route to belong to the West. So these were the three core consensus points. And if there is a consensus in a society about the core issues, then that society, irrespective of changing governments, can go ahead with a fast speed. Many of you experience in the United States what does it mean if partisan behavior is ruining the core consensus in a society and slowing down development of the country. So it's not a Hungary-specific thing, but true for every country. Now, so we were very optimistic about the future, and we thought from now on we will have a linear path of convergence, a quick catch-up to those countries west of us. And it was then that Sir Ralph Dahrendorf, the famous German-born but English social scientist, visited Budapest in 1992. And he gave a very famous interview to Népszabadság, the Hungarian paper. And there he said, you can change the political regime in 6 months. You can change the economic system in 6 years. But to change society, it takes 60 years. And I recall as a student, or just out of university, beginner, that I thought, this is crap. 60 years is too long for me in my life. I don't want to wait 60 years. We have that saying in Hungary, I know a shortcut through the woods. So we will find a way, a shorter way to do this. And now 22 or 24 years later, looking back at that statement, I have to question not whether 60 years is enough, but whether we are on the same route still, where we have started to go 24 years ago. All the 3 core elements that I've mentioned, constitutional, institutional, Western style, rule of law, checks and balances based democracy, market economy based on the dominance of private ownership and limited role of the state, and transatlantic Western alliance, all these 3 elements are in question in Hungary today, and some of those elements are starting to be questioned, sometimes by opposition, sometimes by governments in other countries in the region. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm trying to find an explanation, an answer to you, why is that happening, and what are the consequences of that. We believed in this sort of linear development, the linear convergence. And it was an astonishment to us to see that some countries don't go this linear way, because Hungary was going very fast in the first 10 years based on that consensus. But for example, Slovakia has lost the first decade under the so-called Mečiar years. Czech Republic had sort of similar shorter period of divergences. Poland had a lot of problems, even up to 2005, 6, 7. Each and every country had their zigzags in this linear development. Hungary seemed to have seems to be successful in avoiding this kind of zigzag for a long time. It was a leader of the pack, very successful country in the convergence period in the first 10, 12 years. But soon, the original consensus that was holding this society together, irrespective of the fact that every 4 years we changed government, the core consensus was that. And this consensus started to fall apart around 2001-2. Why did it fall apart? For 2 reasons. One was a so-called development or convergence track. There is a famous thesis in development economics, the so-called Kuznets-Williamson paradigm or thesis, which says in the initial phase of catch-up, or convergence, countries access the target very quickly, but within the countries, regional and social differences are growing very fast. So it's the issue of winners and losers in a society. And here comes political economy. If you cannot, in a democracy, if you cannot make a significant enough part of the active voting population feel to be a winner, then sooner or later they will be interested to slow down and change the process. And while Hungary was successful in catching up very quickly to the European average, it happened parallel with a very low employment rate. 56, 55, 56, 57% employment rate. That means that only every second adult-aged, employment-aged person was active and working legally in Hungary. So that means that huge amount of people were left out of work and thereby they have been left out of becoming middle class. that was going together with major regional differences in our society. We lost, following the convergence from a communist economy to a market-based economy, Hungary, a country of 10 million people, has lost 1.2 million jobs. Of that, 1 million was never recovered, not until today. So that has destabilized the society in terms of quickly growing social differences. Some other countries, for example, the Czech Republic, was much more successful with a different kind of privatization process in keeping employment higher, 65-ish%, 63, 66. That difference explains partly the bigger stability of some other Visegrad countries. So winners and losers can change the political equation. If they change the political equation, if a huge amount of people are interested in maintaining a high level of social redistribution, that is putting a huge burden on a converging economy. So that's part of the political economy explanation of what's happening. The second is that after 2000, a new style of politics has started in Hungary, the politics of division lines. In their quest for power, political parties have started two tracks. One was this social redistribution politics, social promises to win votes, which put Hungary on an unsustainable economic path and was gradually eating up competitiveness. The other type of politics was identity politics. And identity politics in that part of the world pretty much means nationalism. So through a series of political conflicts between the two sides of politics in Hungary, the middle of the country, the center ground of Hungarian politics was torn into two halves, and Hungary has become an extremely divided country politically. And that means that two camps on the right and on the left came glued together, fighting each other, and in the center of the society there was a deepening canyon, which has stopped the original consensus in our society. And when the consensus was gone, each and every election became a matter of life and death for each side. That has made that has meant that Hungary has lost its original fast-growing convergence path. Hungary turned toward a slowing down economic and social policy, and Hungary became so divided politically that if the government, the actual government, has started some reform process or a major transformation, the opposition has killed it immediately with all force possible, irrespective of the merits of those reforms, because there was no consensus in any core field in Hungary. But nowhere in Central and Eastern Europe has such a strong division happened in the center of the society. Now, this was the situation, slowing down economy until the crisis hit all of us in the region in 2008 and 2009. But Hungary was the country hit in the strongest way by the crisis. If you recall, first Iceland went bust, and immediately after that the rumor was that Hungary will be the next. That is partly due to the fact that Hungary inherited and kept the largest debt to GDP from all the former Comecon bloc. So that was partly due to the fact. But the other factor was that because of these policies that I've described, Hungary has lost its growth potential gradually. And if you have a high debt and a low growth potential, then you become an exposed, a risky country. So that was the reason why the crisis hit Hungary particularly hard. But until the crisis, one could have believed that, yes, this is a period of less efficient governance and a zigzag in our political life. So after the crisis, the situation is different because with the impact, with the social impact of the crisis, Hungary and some other countries to a lesser way are exposed to a complete shift from a zigzag convergence path to a complete shift away to a very different social, political, and economic model which is completely different from what we have planned in the 1990s. What happened in my country in 2010, that on the basis of weak governance before the crisis, corruption scandals, disillusionment with the institutions, with the efficiency and productivity of the institutions that were created following the collapse of the communist regime, have been coupled with the extremely negative impact of the crisis. So in 2010, there was a sweeping victory for the opposition party, Fidesz, led by Viktor Orbán, who have been in opposition for 8 years. As a result of the elections in parliament, the new parties, Fidesz and its allies, have received a two-thirds majority in parliament, practically the freedom to do anything they want. There were high hopes that they will use this strong mandate to change the country for the better, to mend those problems which have put Hungary on a slowing path, and they will reform the country in a good direction. Hungary has been successfully surviving the first phase of the crisis through crisis management, so the country was in a relatively stable position when the new government came in. Looking back, I have to say that the two-thirds majority was not used to mend the country's position, but to the opposite. It was a sort of hostile takeover of the country and a full divergence from the original convergence path. Let me tell you what are the key factors of that. New government, on the back of this strong two-thirds majority mandate in parliament, have decided to focus on consolidating its power well beyond the 4-year cycle, to completely change the political regime in Hungary. So they have had a very well-designed plan to break the backbone of Hungarian democracy, going from vertebrae to vertebrae one by one. In several steps which are known to those who follow the Hungarian story, what happened to the constitution, which was introduced very quickly without any proper consultation, fundamentally changing the constitution in Hungary, and then since then amended 5 times, the new constitution. The constitutional court's rights have been significantly diminished, and its role has been significantly diminished, and the members of the constitutional courts have gradually been changed. Judges were sent into early retirement so that a new set of judges can be appointed to leading positions, so that the court system is more friendly. Media law, which was the first big international sign, the new media law was introduced, where a much stronger control over public media, as well as stronger rights on controlling and fining, punishing private media have been introduced. The whole electoral system, election law have been rewritten fundamentally with the two-thirds majority, gerrymandering the districts in Hungary, changing the electoral system fundamentally in favor of the governing parties, etc., etc. Many of the checks and balances have been broken in Hungary. Some of the major institutions have received appointments by the two-thirds majority, personal appointments, where, let me stop here for a second. one key difference between a Western-style democracy, in my mind, and an Eastern-style managed democracy is that in a Western-style democracy, institutions are very strong, and the leaders of those institutions are primarily responsible to the rules of that institution, to the constitutional role of that institution. In Eastern Europe, people are not primarily loyal to their institution, but loyal to their master who appointed them. So many of those appointees have been picked on a personal loyalty basis. I could go on with this long list of legal and constitutional changes, but this was just giving you a short set of examples of how quickly and with a strong will intention a sort of controlled or managed democracy is developed in Hungary. Second, in terms of the economy, a strong preference for the role of the state versus private enterprise was developed. There's a strong centralization ongoing and nationalization of certain key industries, savings cooperatives, utility companies, as well as private pension schemes. 10 years savings of 3 million people have been nationalized. There is a growing and ever-growing role of the state in the Hungarian life. Strong price controls have been introduced in certain sectors, especially energy sector, which is one of the key messages of the government, also in the election campaign, that we keep pushing down energy prices through price control. Certain special sectoral taxes have been introduced to tax those industrial and banking sectors where foreign direct investment has been large, so that those assets are taxed. The third feature is a strong will to revisit the past, to rewrite history. Many such examples can be quoted, starting from the Constitution, the new Constitution, which in its preamble eradicated from 1944 till 1990. That period was somehow considered to be Hungary was under foreign invasion, therefore those years are not part of the Hungarian history. It started with the Constitution up to the very recent event, which has raised a lot of eyebrows around the world, that the government 2 weeks ago announced that they want to stand a memorial statue in one of the main squares in Budapest to the memory of Hungary's occupation by Germany in 1944, depicting Hungary, who has been innocent, and Germany has forced Hungary into the horrors of the Holocaust and the 1944 events, which is a falsification of history. The Hungarian state was actually betraying its own citizens in 1944 under Miklos Horthy's government. The Hungarian state was actively cooperating with Germany in the Holocaust process. And this kind of falsification of history is very dangerous, because if you falsify history, then you are bound to commit the same mistakes in the future. But the reason for this is learning the lesson of George Orwell very well, who controls present, who rules present, rules the past, and those who rule the past will rule the future. That is the idea behind centralizing education in Hungary. All 120,000 teachers are now employed by one single institute, centralizing school books so that there is only very limited selection of material that you can learn from in primary school and secondary school, and many other things. And the fifth thing that is quite typical is shifting alliances. international alliances. As I said, there was a very strong consensus in Hungary to look to the West since 1990, joining the European Union, before that joining NATO, the Transatlantic Alliance. Now this is strongly in question. The government has started a freedom fight, as they call it, against Brussels and against the IMF. This only looked strange, but relatively popular in certain circles of the society. But recently, only 2 weeks ago, the government has announced that it is awarding the largest contract of the last 40 years of a nuclear power plant without any tender to the state-owned Russian Rosatom agency. This deal was done without consultation, without tender, without prior announcement, without any public discussion. And this will expose Hungary to a loan from Russia of 10 billion euros, which would increase the government debt from 80% to 90% to GDP. This will expose Hungary for the next 60 years dependent on fuel, nuclear fuel from Russia. And this will bring Hungary into a situation where it's not only buying 80% of its gas supply from Russia, but also over 60% of its electricity supply will depend on Russian nuclear fuel. So that, combined with other strange things in the last 3 years, an increased appetite for Central Asian political alliances, is definitely a strong shift from a Western alliance and a pragmatic economic and trade-based relationship with other countries towards finding friends where democracy is managed and limited, and finding economic and financial support for sustaining this system, not from our traditional ones. And the sixth such element that is characteristic of this system is a significant redistribution of wealth in our society, a very aggressive redistribution of wealth. Measure, for example, small tobacco shop licenses to be revoked from 35,000 small shopkeepers and given to 3,500 party loyalists, with an increased profit margin and exclusive concessions. And also oligarchistic groups controlling all the public procurements in infrastructure development funded by EU funds and in energy trading. So I don't want to give you too long a list, but these are very characteristic events. If you add up all this is a different political system. And I'm not saying corruption was not present in Hungary. There was a strong corruption, a good Central European average corruption, which is quite strong. Not worse than in the Czech Republic, but not better. I'm not saying that there was no discussion about energy, South Stream, for example, with Russia before, and Hungary has been exposed in terms of energy, traditionally and historically. But I'm saying that this is a new level, a new quality, which is changing the overall design of the Hungarian model. In a way, the current Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, called this an experiment in a lecture at Chatham House. And yes, we all feel like being part of an experiment, like the white mouse. But this experiment is very dangerous and can have wide-ranging effect, sort of contagion effect for the whole of the region. But what is driving this process? What is the thinking behind? I think it's a power logic behind all these events. How can you keep power? Managed democracies can only exist sustainably where they exist if there is some sort of external resource, additional resource that can keep a significant amount of people happy in the society. If you think of Venezuela with the oil income, or Russia or other countries, this extra source of income, natural resources, keep financing the maintenance of such managed or controlled democracies. Hungary doesn't have any such natural resources. So what the government have been doing, they have tried to use existing reserves and resources. They have used the pension fund savings, sacrificing the future, but using that money to finance short-term goals, budget deficit goals, and sustaining a social system to keep their voters relatively happy. The other such political move was in the economy of stagnation that we have. The cake that the nation is cooking for itself or baking for itself every year is getting smaller and smaller. That means, like in the 1930s, that you have to fight in order to keep your slice of the cake. You have to take away from somebody else's slice, because the cake as a whole is shrinking. So the political economy of stagnation is constantly infighting within the society for keeping your or growing your slice of the cake at the expense of somebody else within the same society. So politically, you can only do that if you identify scapegoats, like in the 1930s, whose property, whose assets, whose slice of the cake you can take away to give it to your loyalists or your groups in your society. So that's why the government has started to identify scapegoats and either tax them or take away their money. This sometimes means socially handicapped groups in the society who are less vocal politically. Sometimes it meant foreign investors or large investors or other groups. So the politics of scapegoats is there, but it is threatening the growth potential of the country. The second was using up the reserves of the country, like the pension funds. The third one is after you have used up all these reserves and potentials, how can you sustain your system? You need to find external resources and external support. That is the explanation for this nuclear deal with Russia. Because at the other end of this deal, there is the cheap gas. That is the most important electoral promise of this government. But that means by that, you are sacrificing the sovereignty, a significant part of your sovereignty, in exchange for keeping the power in the country. That's a very dangerous deal. That's a deal where you sell your soul for keeping the power. We have seen it many times in history. However, this economic model is unsustainable. The growth potential of the country is down to 0.5%. With an 80% government debt to GDP, that means that you cannot outgrow your indebtedness. Your debt is bound to grow. And that is a very dangerous process. Secondly, Hungary is losing its potential to grow by close to 500,000 young people leaving the country and trying to work abroad. Here in the US, but more typically in London, is the third largest Hungarian city now, by 150,000 Hungarians working there. Those people, if they would seek a job in Hungary now, the country would explode from the pressure. But if those people do not come back in the next 5 to 10 years, Hungary will implode. Because who will maintain the pension system, who will pay tax, and who will send babies to kindergartens? So that's a matter of life and death. So this system is unsustainable, but it's trying everything, external and internal reserves and external resources, to sustain itself, to keep the power and cement power beyond cycles. But the system that is developing in Hungary is being watched by many other politicians in the region. Because if this system, if this regime receives another mandate, then it will be an important sign for others to try the same battles with the European Union, to try to seek their own way. Opposition parties, for example, in Poland, are praising the Hungarian model already, and they are in the lead against Donald Tusk's coalition. So the potential effect of contagion is high and increasing. That is a potential risk for the whole of the European Union because it could easily destabilize the central and eastern part of the region if this model becomes a fashion. This model is a shift away from the Washington consensus. It's not a shift to the Beijing consensus. I would call it the so-called post-Soviet consensus or model. Many states in Central Asia are developing this kind of model. Strong man, controlling all the institutions, control democracy, oligarchs and clans around the government. But those countries have resources to try and fund this. Hungary doesn't have that. And those countries are not members of NATO and the European Union. So, in this respect, these countries, Hungary is a potential source of contagion and a major risk for the European Union. And the elections that are bound in Hungary in 2 months will be vital from this point of view. They will send a very strong message either way about this system. In this respect, Hungary is going to change, not simply left or right government. It is going to change. It's going to choose its future for a long term. That is what is at stake at the moment. How will it resonate? How will it impact Central and Eastern Europe? How will it impact the European Union? How will it impact the balance between the Eastern and the Western element and the borderlines of those models in Central and Eastern Europe? We are about to see in 2 months. But a lot is at stake. And that is why you here at Columbia, people in the European Union, people in the neighboring countries should watch with interest, with tension, and with concern what is happening in this country. But you cannot change that. You cannot change it from here, you cannot change it from the Czech Republic, and you cannot change it from Brussels. The only people who can change it are the citizens of Hungary. Because any other pressure, attempt, push would just fire back. It is the Hungarians who have to decide about their future, and this election, this choice will be made on the 6th of April. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much. This was a very nice presentation, certainly a perfect introduction for the discussion. Alan and I have agreed to maybe start with a question each or so, right? And then we'll open it up for discussion. You want to go first? Go ahead.
Hard to, excuse me. Hard to answer, to ask any questions, because every question I had, 15 in advance, were answered during the course of the talk. You kept thinking, oh, well, there goes that question. But I'm particularly interested in the discussion, which you didn't use this word, but I had the impression that you're talking about a highly rationalized, highly systematic approach to government, which is perhaps unique in Europe. At first, I thought Hungary was just like 7 other countries, but you convinced me that it's not. It's not as haphazard, say, it's much more systematic, say, than in Ukraine, which is kind of haphazard and just the oligarchs just sort of robbing the country, but it doesn't have the systematic character that you described here. So I guess I want to ask if that is due to a model, if that's a kind of internal development or a universal or a modern form of government. Are we witnessing the decline of neoliberalism, replacement by this kind of model? So sort of comment, I want to ask you for a comment on the sort of status of this particular model development in Hungary, vis-a-vis the world, vis-a-vis history, vis-a-vis other countries.
Go ahead.
Yes, this approach is very systematic when it concerns political power, how to grab, cement, and hold and stabilize consolidate political power beyond political cycles, how to transform them. In terms of economic governance, this is not very successful. If you look at all the major indicators looking ahead, it is forecasting a disaster for Hungary midterm. If you look at the investment rate in the country, now for the third consecutive year, it was below amortization. So what it means, there's a net outflow, a net shrinking of production capacities in this country. If you look at the growth potential, which I've mentioned, is 0.5%. There is no convergence. Europe, the stagnating and problematic Europe, is growing faster on average than Hungary. There is now an artificial pre-election one-off stimulation to the economy through extremely cheap loans from the central bank, but that is bound to run off steam in the second half of next year. So overall, economically, it's quite a mismatch. If you look, I didn't spend much time on explaining what happened in the education system, but the education system, through this centralization and disciplinary method of management, is losing its flexibility and is unable to give answers to Hungary's two biggest problems. One is, how do you bring this country into the knowledge economy so that it can survive in the flood of globalization? And second, how do you integrate the poorest part of our society, the Roma population, which is the fastest growing, demographically fastest growing, but poorest and least educated part of our society? These strategic issues are not answered. Every decision is made from relatively short-term survival mode of power logic, political power logic. But there it's very systematic, you are right. There is a great book published in the US, I read it last year. It was not published by Columbia professor, it was published by two Stanford professors. It's called The Dictator's Handbook. I strongly recommend the book because it gives you this systematic approach to power, which explains through many examples around the world, from Europe to Africa to Asia, or even US, on how these core rules of political power explanation can be developed. Bueno de Mesquita is one of the professors. The other guy, I don't recall the other name, sorry for that. The Dictator's Handbook. There is a very similar book, which is a funny book. Don't mix it up with that. This is a serious book. So, now, in terms of neoliberalism, the current government seemingly has a strong ideology. It is member of the European People's Party, the conservative pan-European party. But in fact, its policies are very often in the populist right and sometimes on the populist left. Nationalization, no respect for private ownership, limiting constitutionalism, or strict price controls in terms of certain sectors cannot be considered as conservative liberal economic policies. But in terms of nationalism and identity politics, it's very strongly in the populist or radical right. So it's a mixture of things. Where it is not is the center. But it would be very difficult to categorize this into one classic ideological pattern.
Thank you.
All right. Well, so let me follow up. My sense is that this is a really excellent account. I think you haven't basically left anything substantive out. So let me go after the thesis that you stated at the end, and I think that's natural given that you're running as leader of the opposition, that it has to be Hungary itself, the citizens who have to resolve the issue. And in principle, I agree. But on the other hand, historically, we have quite a few examples of young democracies who struggle, and especially when there are negative external factors, may not survive. And this could be, in the case of Hungary, the factors are, as you said, the external shock that came with the crisis. Hungary had high debt. It had also a lot of loans denominated in foreign currencies. So when the local currency collapsed, it was very difficult to repay these loans. So lots of hardships coming from the outside. And then just like we see in Ukraine and elsewhere, Russian influence is very strong, trying to bring it in. So you could argue that there are significant external forces which might warrant other democratic countries to not to stay idle. Right? And the example of Slovakia in the 1990s that you mentioned with Mečiar is a very good one. I mean, there the illiberal democracy was very strong, Mečiar, very strong demagogue, very successful. And had it not been for some pressure exerted by the European Union, the threat of not entering the EU, the threat of not being able to enter NATO, I'm not sure that he would have been dislodged, at least not as fast as he was in the end. It took quite a long time. So I guess the question really here is, is it, the appropriate approach by the democratic world to just stay idle, especially if your contagion hypothesis is, has some validity to it.
I have told you, I stand up so that I can see everybody in the back. As I have told you that I believe that this can only be mended and changed from the inside. It is up to the Hungarian citizens. You cannot go against democratic procedures from a democracy point of view. So it's up to us to change this. But Hungary has to understand that it's part of an alliance on mutual interest. And if I believe that such a system, this kind of post-Soviet state model, cannot be consolidated long-term within the current framework of the European Union. Either the European Union has to change and give up many of its core values and operational models. This is, I hope, unlikely. Second, either or Hungary has to change, or well, these are the two core options. But this cannot fit together long-term. Now, so those who try to stabilize this system in Hungary have to face the challenge of what would happen if Hungary cannot stay part of that group. And for example, this recent deal on the nuclear power plant is very clearly showing the divergence from all those values and merits that the European Union or NATO represents for Hungary. Now, I often receive the question, why is the EU not more efficient in dealing with these problems which are obviously against the core interest of the EU? The European Union, in this respect, has a fault by design. So-called Copenhagen criteria, which is the criteria based on which new members join the European Union, is only measured and reviewed at the moment of accession, at the moment of joining the European Union. Later on, there are no methods to look at systematically whether countries are not sliding back into a previous state. There are no measures for that, no institutions for that. Now there is a proposal from several foreign ministers in Europe, to a large extent based on the Hungarian problems, to establish such measures and institutions. But they are still, this idea is still in its infancy, it's not yet improved. But some previously unprecedented things have already happened. For example, the so-called Tavares report in the European Parliament was discussed, and there was a significant majority vote denouncing some of these aspects that the government has done in Hungary. The government is trying to show it to the public as it's an attack on Hungary. But no, it's an attack on what the government is doing in Hungary. That's quite different. So the problem of the EU that its legal framework enables it to look at the means, but it doesn't enable it to look at the end. But the means are always leading to an end. And if you can only look at, in detail, single means, without looking at the whole picture and the result of those means, then it can easily be misled. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, had a very famous speech, a domestic speech to his audience, but a big audience, where he said, our strategy towards the EU is like the dance of the peacock. We know what we want to achieve. We jump further than what we want to achieve because we know we are going to be attacked. Then we step back 2 little steps. Then we jump again. And that's what has happened. All these changes took place. The European Union has achieved, through its legal pressure, some amendments to these issues that I've listed to you in terms of the democratic system. But fundamentally, the system has been changed. And those minor shifts have not altered or not stopped the slide back of Hungarian democratic institutions. So in this respect, the European Union is not prepared for that. And it could only change if there is a very strong political will inside, not the Commission. The Commission is not a political body, but inside the European Council. And for that, these countries in the European Union would need to understand that it is their core interest that is at stake here. But even if that takes place, I have to go back to my last sentence from the introduction. Even if that takes place, it would be wrong to assume that this situation can be changed from the outside. This situation can only be changed by the citizens of Hungary who have to choose between 2 very different futures.
Let's open it up for discussion. So go to the microphone, briefly identify yourself. The microphone is right here. And keep it short, brief. Thanks.
Hi, Daniel Goldman. I'm an alum of the college. Thank you very much for the talk. What public policy measures and areas of financial sector development do you think would be most conducive to fostering a transition to a knowledge economy in Hungary? And to what extent do you think that the experiences of Asian countries that successfully transition to knowledge economies without substantial natural resource endowments are instructive in that regard?
Did we collect 3, 4 questions?
Yeah, let's collect 3, 4.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Holly Case. I teach history at Cornell University. I have a couple of questions. One is, you're no doubt familiar with different parts of Hungary, being from Szeged. I was wondering if you could talk about how some of these developments have played out outside of the city's capital, or the nation's capital, and whether the differentiation you talked about, the stratification in society, is one essentially between the metropole and the countryside, or if it's taking place elsewhere. Where is it most visible? And the second question is, it strikes me that there are a number of phenomena that you discussed as being sort of part of the problem: the rising debt, the dependence on Russia, control of the media, control of the narrative about the past, that are part of the critique that that the current regime makes of the communists. Why is it not? Why is this rhetoric not being used against them? And is it because the opposition is inherently tainted by association with the communist regime in some way, or is it because that wouldn't work for whatever reason? I'm just wondering whether that similarity strikes the population of Hungary as well, or would play.
Szabolcs Márka, I teach physics at Columbia. So I would like to know about the global security consequences of the nuclear reactor deal, and what are the detailed economic consequences of that. Having spent nuclear fuel is quite a bit of problem.
Right, let's stop here for a moment. So first, transformation to knowledge economy was the core question. In a wider sense, for the whole of the Visegrad 4 countries, the last 20 years was, in different pace, but rather successful transition from a communist state-owned heavy industry sector to becoming sort of the new manufacturing bed for Europe. Many, many high-tech companies have moved to this part of the region. I'm talking from Poland down to Slovenia. Automotive sector, IT, communications sectors, certain global services, and So that was very successful because of the sort of value for money wages. It's not anymore the lowest cost wages, but value for money. It brought a lot of technical knowledge and know-how transfer to this part of the world. This was enabled by foreign direct investment in the region. And this has accelerated the convergence. Now, the earlier model of purely attracting foreign direct investment based on relatively cheap labor force with the crisis is over. Because the name of the game in Europe is not anymore expansion, but focus. So these countries have to make a new offer, and this is true for all of us, to foreign direct investors. The result of these 20 years of economic transformation means that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe are not at all similar to those countries in Southern Europe within the European Union who are having serious growth problems. Because we do have an industrial base, a modern industrial base, modern technology, and we have certain know-how. Whereas some countries in the south, Greece or Portugal, partly Spain, or southern part of Italy, has this lack of industrialization, which makes it much more difficult for them to change quickly. So we are in a much better situation. But the big question will be in Europe that the center of Europe, the well-developed so-called Nordic countries, including Germany, northern countries, have sort of escaped from the trap of globalization into the knowledge economy. And us in Central and Eastern Europe have to attach our boat to their ship. If we can do that, if we can continue technology transfer, and if we can develop our own sort of know-how based economy in this innovative economy in these societies, then we can stay as part of the mainstream European development. If not, then we will gradually be downgraded into low-cost manufacturing. Now, what is the secret to achieve that? Number one is education. Number two is education, and number three is education. Proper education from kindergarten to integrate those Roma children who are now losing out for the rest of their life at the age of 3, 4, 5, up to the higher education and post and adult education. Every segment of that has to be changed and improved. That is the biggest and most important thing. Before the crisis, Hungary was not doing bad. In 2007, every third job in Europe in the R&D sector was created in Hungary. Every third R&D job. Pharmaceuticals, biotech, car, automotive sector, IT sectors, a lot of R&D jobs were created in the country. The problem is now those people are cheaper to get if they migrate to another country. And our job would be to retain the people and bring the enterprises to Hungary and not send the people out to Germany or England. But for that we need great education, and we need a system that is incentivizing investment, foreign direct investment in technology in Hungary. And for that we need much better universities. That's the short answer. This has little to do with natural resources. Actually, natural resources are often pushing countries into denying knowledge and focusing on the cheap and easy income. You know, this so-called Dutch disease problem. Countryside, rural versus urban part of Hungary. I was only born in Szeged, but I'm from Baja. It's a much smaller city, but I'm very proud of it because of the fish soup. This was a personal note. But yes, I'm from the country. I came to Budapest only for university. And I go to the university. I go to the country a lot, especially to the depressed regions of Hungary, which there are a lot of them. One of the key problems that not only there was a social gap growing in the country after the collapse of the communist regime, but also that it has become regional. So in certain regions there is no hope. It's like in the UK after the collapse of the coal industry, for example. So the key task is, if you want to make the society integrated and interested in growth, in a growth-based policies, you have to integrate those people back into jobs. So you need to focus on those depressed regions and bring investment over to that part of the country and create jobs there. That's the core of the matter. We have designed a program of 1 billion euros worth of investment program, just focusing on the most depressed regions, and that investment will be financed mostly from European Union funds to have them to catch up. But also we have designed a program that goes back to the previous question, that young people who have a university diploma, if they decide to return to a depressed region and start their job there as doctors or teachers or engineers, then they will get an extra support because they go back and keep younger generations in those depressed regions, which is very, very rare today. Yes, if the Hungarian society can be, probably from the political point of view, can be split into three categories. One, the winners of the transformation in the last 20 years, who are urban, educated, and who are winning from the whole European accession and convergence process. The second part is people who would be interested to retain the security, job security and public security of the previous period, and those who would be interested to avoid the growing competition and competitiveness in our society, and who would like to sort of receive more support from the state, understandably, for their stabilization. And then the third category is people who are switch off. They are so down and out that they cannot, they do not participate in the political process. They are very inactive politically, and usually they are losers of political games because they cannot represent their interests. These three groups are present in the Hungarian society, and the third group has been growing since the crisis with Hungary. I don't know, does this answer your first question? The second is whether what is being done in Hungary is practically a communist type of political strategy. I think, yes, many of the things that the governing parties have been criticizing in the past, and they claim themselves to be the most anti-communist party in power, although they didn't open the secret files from pre-1990 of the communist agents, which is questionable why they didn't do that. But I think the methods that I've listed to you and you have mentioned are not specific to the communists. It's simply methods to consolidate power against the checks and balances and institutional democracies. If you read that book that I mentioned, The Dictator's Handbook, it is quoting you many examples which has nothing to do with communists, but those are simply pragmatic measures. We have been showing in our communication the problems, or the antagonism between the deeds and the words. But I think people are less interested in ideologies than the actual result of those measures. Nuclear security and economy of the power plant. Hungary is a relatively friendly country when it comes to nuclear energy, compared to other countries, for example, Germany or Austria, who are much more hostile to this form of energy. But I think two things have changed in the last 5 years in terms of nuclear energy. One, that post-Fukushima, the security expectations towards nuclear energy are much higher. And we don't see that the nuclear industry has already followed up on those new higher standards that are requested. So I don't see why Hungary should decide now and not wait until such nuclear power plants are tested in practice. But I'm not an expert on that. You, Sabi, know much more about nuclear energy than I do. But the main criticism on this deal is not technological. I don't believe that the Russian technology is worse significantly than US or French or Korean or Japanese technology that are available in the world. The concern is partly, why don't we wait? If we want nuclear energy, that should be decided through a public referendum, because it will decide the energy future of the country for the next 60, 70 years. Secondly, if the decision is that we want nuclear energy, then it should be done through a proper tender, proper preparation process, buying for the best value, the most safe technology, which is efficient enough to provide us electricity at a good price. Based on calculations, this power plant would produce electricity at double of the current energy prices, double. And there are many other problems with that. Hungary would have roughly 8 to 10 years to decide and then build before the current power plants are expiring, if we want to choose nuclear energy. So why is this rush? And the answer is political. That there is a deal next to it, which is around gas, cheap gas. Russia is offering cheap gas to Hungary, which enables the government to continue with its election promise of cutting utility costs. We have seen the problems in the Ukraine and Belarus from getting used to cheap gas. I call it the drug dealer strategy, because you give the first 3 doses of cocaine to children for free, and when they get used to it, you can ask them a price. So that's very dangerous. It would be much better for Hungary to keep it off the drugs, and if half of the money that is designed for this nuclear plant would be spent on energy savings, then we could cut energy demand in Hungary by 20-30% in gas and electricity, partly electricity. That would be the best and the fastest return on investment that we can imagine at the moment. And then I didn't yet speak about alternative energy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Lucia Cannon. I'm an alumna of Columbia University. First point is I would like to challenge what you said about the cheap production moving to Eastern Europe, because I just wrote a paper on Poland, and actually I see that there is a rush of investment because of the crisis. So a lot of factories from Western Europe are actually moving to Poland. And another thing is that there's also this trend of nearshoring, where a lot of companies are moving their factories from China into Eastern Europe because they want to have it near, because transportation costs are too expensive, because there are too many problems with currencies and politically. So I would challenge that part of your presentation. And another thing that struck me was the question that you said that the current government is changing the model from the Washington consensus to a post-Soviet consensus. And I was very involved in Washington consensus from 1989 and working on reforms in Eastern Europe. And it seems to me that the question of Washington consensus broke down long time ago. It was long time ago, you know, in the 1990s, it was decided that Washington consensus was not a good model of development, that there were many discussions at the IMF and the World Bank. There was a discussion of the new institutionalism, and I think this is an issue where you have change in judiciary, essentially removing the old communist judges and trying to build more Western-style institutions in this very important area. So I think that, maybe we are beyond new institutionalism, and now there is a new discussion of what is actually sort of, and this is true in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe also, what is the new model of economic development? What are the sources of growth? So in a sense, I wouldn't call it post-Sovietism. It's an experimentation of where the whole Europe is moving, and I think that Eastern Europe is a special case because they have special problems. But I think that you certainly cannot compare it to post-Sovietism of Central Asia.
Other questions? Sir, or whoever you are, there, please, yes.
Hi, my name is Alexei Martinyuk. I'm actually a student here at SIPA, and I'm migrated from Russia to US some time ago. And for me, what's interesting is that I'm not going to go back to Russia, not because of economic possibilities. I mean, it's actually very easy to make money there, but because of the human rights issues. And I want to ask, with this developments, change of trajectory for Hungary, what do you think is going to happen with human rights and civic liberties, and how it's going to affect also the retention of human capital?
Thank you. One more for this round, and then we'll ask Mr. Bajnai to answer, please.
Patrick Stadlofer, I'm a student at Columbia Business School. And I was curious, do you think the EU should have some way to give teeth to the Copenhagen criteria after it's in? In the US, you have the Republican form of government guaranteed to the states by the federal, and obviously the EU is nowhere near that. But do you think there should be some kind of EU mechanism of power to try to keep countries within the accepted order of the rule of law, and if that's feasible? Thank you.
On your two remarks, the first one, I agree with. If in terms of what I was trying to say, that I think the name of the game has changed. There is no more expansion in the sort of European investment, but rather focus. But focus means you try to find the best location and concentrate your efforts there. And what you mentioned as nearshoring is pretty much, or the increase in Poland, investments in Poland, and in other parts of Europe are the result of this kind of focus. Hungary has been an early winner of that. In 2009 and 10, we have received two major investments from Audi and Mercedes. It's other sequence. First Mercedes, then Audi, concentrating their production to Hungary. Even Opel, General Motors, have concentrated their production from other countries there. So yes, I underwrite what you say, that this process is ongoing. And these countries can be winners of that process, because still they are not anymore the cheap producers, but value for money, relatively highly trained, experienced, technological, knowledgeable, stable workforce, extremely good locations or logistical facilities compared to China or other countries in Asia. Except for what I told you about Hungary, the other countries are politically stable and calculable in terms of the legal environment. And these are the key factors. So yes, I agree with nearshoring, and this region could be a winner of the next round. What I was trying to say, if it is not enough, we need to do more. We need to generate our own innovative skills, or bring over knowledge centers and know-how centers or research centers to our side. But I agree with you in that. In the second part of the discussion, Washington consensus versus post-Soviet consensus. I know that there is a broader interpretation of the Washington consensus, which is the neoliberal economic policies that the IMF have pursued in the 80s, 90s. When I refer to the Washington consensus, I try to set it in front of the Beijing consensus. Two different sort of models of governance. One is still based on democracy, pluralism, private property-based market economy, etc., versus a state-run Mandarin-style government and experimenting and all that stuff. And what I try to explain that all the problems of neoliberal economic policies, which have to a large extent failed, and the crisis have shown their failure or overextension probably is the right thing. In my mind, for me, do not question the fundamentals of capitalism, private ownership, and strong institutions and checks and balances based constitutional democracy. So if this, in this broad sense, we mean the Washington Consensus, then I believe that we have to learn from the mistakes but stick to the core. And for us in this part of the world, I don't see the Beijing Consensus as an option because we don't have the 4,000-year-old Mandarin culture that makes it workable, and because I believe that this system has more way to correct itself from time to time. I think what we have seen in 2008 and 9 is a very deep crisis in capitalism, and then as a result in society and democracy. But it's not the crisis of capitalism and not the crisis of democracy in most countries. In those countries where the original accumulation of democratic capital, to use a Marxist term, did not go far enough, these changes, this destabilization of the middle classes are threatening the core of the system, the democratic nature of the system, like in the 1930s in Germany. Now, in Germany, there was a lot of accumulation of democratic capital since then, so they are not threatened by that. But in those countries which are new democracies, this is a real threat. So, when I refer to the so-called post-Soviet model, I was trying to look at what are the characteristics of some post-Soviet countries in their way of running and building and managing their country. And I found many similarities to what is the intention or what is the practice of the Hungarian government. And that I stick to my position on that, that what is happening in Hungary is following that suit and is distancing Hungary from its original path that it set upon in 1990. There is one fundamental dilemma that I didn't mention, which is very important, and your question raised that, and it's important. One of the core dilemma for each of the Visegrad countries, that they have started to converge to a region, European Union, which is finding itself in a crisis. So you want to converge to something, but what you see, your role model is in crisis. So it's not enough to converge, you have to do better, or you have to avoid the mistakes that have caused the crisis of Western Europe, if I can put it that way. And that's a real dilemma, and there is role for experimenting and thinking, but not at the expense of democracy, and not at the expense of market, the fundamentals of market economy, in my mind. Human rights and human capital. Hungary keeps receiving worsening grades according to human rights activist organizations in terms of corruption, freedom of media, civil society. But I would not say that in Hungary the human rights problems are comparable to, for example, the Central Asian parts of the world or communist countries or anything like that. Very often the limitation on expressing one's opinion is not limited by for the individual. It's limited through the increasing financial control over the media, for example. So it's not the individual rights that are being affected there, but more the system as it's building up is there. But yes, when I go to the country, I very often get remarks from men of the street that they are afraid. They are afraid of losing their jobs if they are teachers or other forms of government employees, or if they are small entrepreneurs, they are afraid of not getting the contract from the municipality if they express a strong political opinion. So yes, this kind of fear factor has increased significantly during the last 4 years due to the style of governance in Hungary. And certain human rights issues are of concern. The extreme right, which is, I would like to be clear, it's not the government. When I talk about the extreme right, I talk about Jobbik and its allies, who are in parliament, but not in government. The role of the extreme right is growing. Anti-Semitism is growing. I don't think that the Hungarian government is anti-Semitic. I'd like to be very distinctive and decisive about that. I do think they are pragmatic and sometimes cynical, trying to attract radical right or far-right voters, and they often imply double speech in these type of situations, like recently with the statute that I mentioned in my introductory speech. But we have to differentiate, because sometimes in the Western press I see washing together or pushing together the extreme right, which is not in government in Hungary, and I hope never will be, and the sometimes very radical views of Fidesz. These are not the same. But I do condemn the government for being pragmatic, cynical, or dual, double speech about some of those issues. EU and Copenhagen criteria. Yes, there has to be some form of a mechanism to watch the compliance with the fundamental values and rules of the European Union. After all, and first of all, above all, Europe is a value-based union, sharing its common values. And you can only build strong alliances on common values. You can have pragmatic allies for this and that. But if your core values are not the same, core values are driving politics, and then politics will drive away those temporarily common interests. That is why I believe that the United States and the European Union are long-term the most natural allies to themselves. The United States can experiment with alliances in Asia or elsewhere, but if the core values are not the same, those will be pragmatic alliances. But Europe and the US belong together based on shared values in fundamental cultural roots. That is true for the European Union. The European Union existed in the year 1000 when Hungary was founded by its first king. It was a spiritual union of Jewish Christian heritage, Greek Jewish Christian heritage. That was at the time, the church was the decisive institution of the European Union at the time. Now we have a much more efficient and pragmatic and worldly European Union now, but it's still based on shared values. Partly those values that I mentioned: democracy, freedom of speech, human rights, institutions, market economy, which 1,000 years or 2,000 years long experimenting have taught us what works and what doesn't work long term. And I do believe that we should insist on those, because long term this is the interest of each of our nations and our common interest of the European Union. So the European Union should be able to monitor, review, and motivate countries to stay and stick to these values.
Great. Well, time's up. On behalf of all three institutions that co-sponsored this event, let me thank you again, and please join me and give a hand to our speaker. Thank you.